Wow, it looks like Woodstock out there. Thanks for coming. Thanks to John and Carol's and to the New England Review and Carolyn and Stephen and all the great people there. And it's an honor to be on the stage with Jessica and John and Julia, some of my favorite writers. And I'm afraid I'm just going to have to be the spinach that you have to eat before you get to the wonderful delights to follow, because this is fresh off the printer, and it's fact heavy. I'm going to tell you that right off the bat, and detail heavy. So don't worry as you're trying to grasp onto everything. If you just let them wash over you like waves, by the time you get to the end, you'll get it, because I just say the same thing over and over again anyway. It's about a trip I took to South Africa in 2009, and it's the next chapter of a project I've been working on for quite a while. It's called Blombos. In 1995, archaeologist Chris Henshelwood dug an oblong piece of ochre small enough to fit in the hand out of the 77,000-year-old level of Blombos Cave on the western Cape Coast of South Africa. The nearest source of the naturally occurring earth pigment lay 9 kilometers away, meaning it had been carried there deliberately and for a purpose. The cave mouth had a narrow lip overlooking a nearly vertical drop 200 feet above the Indian Ocean. Surf crashed onto apartment house-sized boulders directly below. At the floor level, the ceiling was so low, a person 5 feet tall could only crouch or sit inside, yet the cave held numerous bifacial blades, hearths, shells from local tortoises and seals, and from the mollusks and crustaceans still common along the wild coasts, beaches, and tide pools. The ochre, abundant in the strata across 25,000 years of sporadic occupation, could have been used for body ornamentation. People all over the world still dye their skin and hair with its oily red color, powdered and moistened as a mastic for affixing tiny stone bladelets to a wood or bone haft, or both. Added to the existence of distinct shell beads from the species Necerius kraussianus, or tick shell, a small whelk common in the tide pools at the foot of the cliff. Either use and the distance from the source would have added to the growing evidence of some altering, some change in the habits, minds, and intelligence of the coast's Middle Stone Age Homo sapiens. This particular ochre was special, oily earthen red, its edges squared by human hands, and holding a distinct diamond pattern etched into 2 of its facing sides. The design may have been from nature, like the diamondback pattern many reptiles exhibit. It may have been an abstraction or something seen in a vision, but it is still common in traditional art and designs all over the world. If the date held up, the ochre would have been the oldest geometric representation of its kind etched into a durable material, a symbolic expression in material form, hard evidence for the artist's ability to think metaphorically, therefore possibly to have language, story, religion. At the time of Henshelwood's discovery, however, the science had already begun to coalesce around the period beginning around 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens started showing up in Western Europe, competing with and supplanting the Neanderthal, as the moment when the archaeological record showed the beginnings of external symbolic projection in the sudden appearance of cave art paintings, and in the evidence like beads from distantly acquired materials for body ornamentation, symbolic of group identification and social hierarchy. These were all considered markers for the kinds of intelligence and feeling we recognize as being like ourselves. Ourselves, in this case, meaning the range and extent of present human expression. In other words, modern, human. Around the same time, Richard Klein, a molecular biologist at Stanford University, had hypothesized that since every advance in stone tool technology had, up until the European cave paintings, been associated with an increase in brain size, weight, and density, that since every advance in stone tool technology had, up until the cave paintings, been associated with an increase in brain size, weight, and density, it must have taken a genetic mutation, undetectable in the molecular, genetic, or intracranial records, to cause the unexampled and sudden creative explosion, or Big Bang, as he called it, that characterized the cave art. Eons of mute hand axes, then spang. There was Chauvet-Pont d'Arc, the dramatic underground galleries in France's Ardèche Valley, 33,000 years old and discovered only in 1992. Klein's idea sounded scientific, explanatory, but he couldn't prove it. Research money poured in that direction nevertheless. PhDs, postdocs, and tenured chairs wrote on the inevitable discovery through genetics or archaeology of some hard corroborating evidence. Then Henshelwood found his ochre. Originally, Henshelwood had intended no more for his dig at Blumboss than to uncover evidence for the modern precursors of the local Khoisan people, and to stop at the end of the late Stone Age 2,000 years ago. And that's what he did. He found what he was looking for, wrote his dissertation, and got his PhD. Below 2,000 years, however, he'd hit a stratum of wind-driven dune sand 6 inches deep with no sign of occupation. The sand should have told Henshelwood he'd reached the earliest occupation, and nothing further remained to be found. But for some reason he still doesn't understand, he went back and kept digging, down through the sterile sand layer, and broke through at 50,000 years to artifacts from the short-lived Still Bay culture, named after the fishing village a few miles down the coast. He found interesting bifacial blades and shells, but when he closed up the dig that season, he had no compelling reason or money to go back. Yet he did. The ochre lay at a point 22,000 years earlier than Klein's 50,000-year mark and 45,000 years earlier than Chauvet. Leave aside for the moment exactly what we thought we meant by human, creative, or symbolic, or why it seemed so important, or that the Cro-Magnon people of Chauvet lived side by side with Neanderthals, a separate human species, for 35,000 years, or why we still assume that since the creative explosion happened, it must have happened exclusively in the genetic makeup of the brain. The Blumboss ochre was a far less dramatic find than Chauvet by a long shot. Aesthetically, you could call it understated, minimalist, as befitted stingier natural surroundings, the Western Cape's steep escarpments of boulders, Cape cobras, and crashing surf. Yet there it was. Some questioned the dating. The ochre could have sunk down from a shallower later stratum, and existing methods couldn't measure the ochre itself. So until something better came along, Henshelwood knew he needed to support his case not only empirically but epistemologically, just as Klein had built a case to support his circumstantial evidence. He also knew what the Oxbridge establishment had done to Stellenbosch University's Hilary Deakin a few years before, when Deakin had delivered papers there shortly after the end of apartheid on suspiciously symbolic-looking finds from around Clause's River mouth in the Eastern Cape. Nets for hunting birds and to some extent fishing, snares for dussies or rock hyrax, the woodchuck-like rodent of the coastal cliffs, tortoise and ostrich shells that had been cracked open for food and used as tools, and beads. The reception that had been brutal, not so much for the finds themselves, but for Deakin's interpretation of them as modern and their evidence of social distinction, hierarchy, symbolic thinking. Klein and the current science had taken for granted that the creative explosion's source and timing would be found in a brain mutation. The same assumption that conscious states are brain states and nothing else has driven many treatments for neurological disorders, opened the door to huge profits for drug companies, and marginal improvements for Parkinson's sufferers and the depressed. President Obama's recent $30 billion initiative to map the brain is promoted as leading directly to a better understanding of the mind, as well as to cures for brain and psychological disorders. Indeed, it's hard to argue against evidence that injury to brain tissue damages an individual's sense of self and agency and ability to think. But if the Blumboss ochre held up, it would imply that human symbolic capacity, and by implication consciousness, had as much to do with where you found its evidence as when. In other words, it would remove consciousness, mind, as an exclusive property of the brain and move it somewhere else, to other organs, the rest of the body, perhaps outside the body. Even for us to detect such a shift in expression, it would have to be projected, in the terms of Canadian psychologist Merlin Donald, that is, cast into some sort of concrete physical manifestation sufficiently durable or protected to survive intact for millennia outside the brain, for instance, in the form of certain tools, pictures, representational objects, yet also outside speech, dance, music, or ritual, all abilities that exhibited symbolic capacity and may in fact already have existed when the ochre was incised, but that left no trace. For Henshelwood, it all rested on the dating. If it held up, it would mean the anatomical and cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking existed with the speciation event that produced Homo sapiens in Central Africa 250,000 to 200,000 years ago, a drop in the bucket, and wasn't from a random biological switch being thrown. Rather, it grew out of our immediate experience of living in, interacting with, and surviving within specific environments, places, and growing well-fed populations with the possibility for rich interactions. The undertaking gave Henselwood a good deal of pause. His own employment in a bad market depended on him getting it right. But he couldn't not publish about it, any more than he could rebury the ochre and tell the world to forget he had found it. So he had to keep digging in the earth to find corroborating evidence of his own, but also philosophically to really try to figure out exactly what it was he and his colleagues were finding and what it was they were looking for. By the time I got there, the Blombos ochre had been accepted widely as authentic. Henselwood had been written about it in the New York Times. He was employed, well-financed, and a recipient of well-deserved respect. As if by destiny, the necessary dating technique had come along, single-grain optically stimulated luminescence that measures the age of quartz and the surrounding layers, and shown what Henselwood had known all along, that the ochre predated Klein's 50,000-year mark by 22 millennia. I spent 3 days observing the dig at the beginning of the 2009 season. Early mornings I rode with Henselwood and his crew, plowing through the coastal vegetation regime called Strundveld in his powerful Toyota to the edge of the escarpment. There we unloaded the equipment and walked for a mile on the steep, narrow path, laterally and down across the slope to the cave site. We all carried something, a jug of water, a heavy instrument in a backpack, a fuel can. It was rough going. The rugged coast curved vertiginously away in both directions and plunged down to the indigo water, bereft of any human sign, the waters empty of any but the very rare local fishing boat. The trail had abrupt drop-offs and switchbacks and empty gaps you had to hop across with your load. The colors were pale blue, deep blue edging toward violet, pale green, earthy sulfur. The cave mouth and lip lay under an even larger overhanging ledge that made a grand amphitheater in the cliff. You approached it from slightly below, and the effect of it looming over you felt orchestral, minimizing. 50 feet above the cave, a much larger cave yawned, inside the amphitheater, its ceiling fallen in huge fractured blocks, rendering its presumed rich load of artifacts beyond the reach of archaeology. On our first day, the crew opened the cave mouth, removing the sandbags that had blocked it over the winter from coastal storms and possible looters, while I watched her climb down the steep pitch to explore amid the jumble of huge boulders at low tide. When everything was set up and half the morning had passed, Henselwood lectured the team, which included his co-director Karen von Niekirk, use-wear specialist Renata Garcia Moreno, and 3 grad students. Previous digs had been compromised by bad techniques and practices, Henselwood began. We always excavate from the known into the unknown, he reminded them. So they had to shave away the surface of a level rather than dig straight down and harm or disturb invisible objects. He described how they divided a level into subdivisions of what they believed to be single occupations, though they had no way of being sure of that, and using an instrument called a Z level, the same sort of water level used to build the pyramids, he pointed out, to measure the depths of the finds and plot the exact locations of the hearths. We want to find where the people were living, Henselwood said, because most of the tool concentrations are around hearth areas. That's where people would have been sitting. That's where they would have been talking to one another, socializing, making their beads, making their stone tools. Obviously, they were eating around the fire, but certainly we think a lot of the production was around the fire. So we're interested in spatial patterns. You're looking for how people used space when they lived here, not just looking for stuff. Every day I peered over the edge of the excavation, down onto the square, where Henselwood sat on his stool, wielding his brush and scraper. Behind him, the rest of the crew stood by, recording data, measuring and cataloging his finds, and placing them in glassine bags. He wore an instrument like a loop on a headband and plied a brush and small trowel over each quadrant of his square meter at the 100,000-year level, taking pains to expose its riches, mostly shell and ochre fragments, and record their relation to one another, the importance of the hearth and use of space being signatory of symbolic awareness. 6'4", resembling Sam Shepard, Henselwood had fished the surf and tide pools, caught and shelled the same mollusks and crustaceans, the same tortoises, hunted and roasted the same dussies as the shells and bones he was finding in the 3-foot square hearth. Nothing here was strange or new to him. It had shaped him and shaped his view, as it must have the ancestors he studied. The cave lay, fortuitously, as it turned out, on property Henselwood's anti-apartheid Liberal Party family had owned since the 30s. His grandfather was a Supreme Court judge from Cape Town. A sizable frontage of coastline, as well as upland farmland and feinboss, the characteristic chaparral-like ecosystem of the Western Cape's Mediterranean climate. The compound of houses and outbuildings nestled at the edge of the dune where miles of curving protected public beaches ran up against the sea and wind-blasted sandstone cliffs, and rubble falls interrupted by no curving beaches for miles to the east, the direction of the cave. Evenings we ate grilled ostrich steaks on the veranda, gazing at the sun setting behind Cape Agulhas, the southernmost point of Africa, 70 or 80 miles west. The backs and fins of dolphins iridesced in the foamy troughs and crests of the slow-breaking waves, and Henshelwood told me he had seen 200 or 300 southern right whales at a time out there during calving season. Upwelling currents from deep canyons offshore kept the seas rich with plankton and crustaceans that grew the larger predator species, and there were seals and otters, as well as great whites and a variety of endemic game fish. The walls of the main house in the dunes held faded snapshots and Kodachrome prints of great-looking outdoors and women holding up enormous blacktip, rock cod, and kingfish, and portraits of local Khoisan and Afrikaner farmers and neighbors. Stone blades and hand axes, mostly from the Middle or Late Stone Ages, lay on the windowsill over the kitchen sink and in the front hall, on the coffee table and on top of the piano. The west end of the building opened onto the outdoor terraces, looking down over the curving scythe of protected beach and operatic surf. The whole thing, the house, the cave, the ochre, had a weird, improbable quality that had helped cast the initial doubts on the discoveries there by a freshly minted PhD. Yet it made it seem fated. A lot was going on in South African archaeology. Caves up and down the coast were giving up evidence of a flow back and forth between symbolic early cultures, the advances and disappearances partly climate-driven, and of new food sources like protein and fat-rich shellfish, increasing brain density, body sizes, and populations, all around 100,000 to 75,000 years ago. At the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, anthropologist David Lewis Williams had teamed up with the father of French cave art studies, Jean Clotte, and proposed a shamanic theory of rock and cave art and of early consciousness, wherein altered states produced recurring neurologically induced geometric patterns that got projected on the walls, cliffs, and on handheld objects, spirals, cross-hatchings, and diamonds, and that conferred on the artist access to the hidden dimension behind the rock's surface. So the ochre hadn't emerged in a vacuum. I had gone to Blombos expressly to get as close as I could to the geographic origins of consciousness, and to trace that line where our subjective experience and the physical world flowed together. For the moment, this particular stretch of coast owned the most tangible claim to that distinction. Here we found the earliest empirical evidence for some aspect of human consciousness we called symbolic thinking, and it couldn't have been more stretched out, bleached out, crooked, weathered, hammered, broken, relentless, difficult. That it carried strange overtones as well didn't surprise me. Out of it had emerged a new kind of visible thing, a diamond pattern scratched on a rock that may have been the same design its creator tattooed or painted on his body. And it wasn't only strange, it was as wild as you can get. Thank you.